Baruch Spinoza was about to commit the greatest intellectual crime of his era. No weapons were involved, no blood would be spilled, but what he planned to do would destroy the peace between Christians and Muslims forever. The year was 1670, and Spinoza had just made a decision that would change the history of religious philosophy. He would analyze Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad exactly the same way he would analyze any other political or social leader in history, without reverence, without fear, without limits. The result was an explosion of discoveries that shook the foundations of two of the world's largest religions. Spinoza found similarities between Jesus and Muhammad that no theologian had publicly admitted. He discovered differences that revealed the true intentions behind their messages, and most importantly, he proved that both were masters in the art of conquering hearts and minds. Spinoza's work was immediately attacked by all religious authorities in Europe and the Middle East. His books were banned. His ideas were declared heretical. He himself was persecuted until his death, but Spinoza had planted a seed of truth that would grow in secret for centuries. A truth about the human nature of Jesus and Muhammad, a truth about how extraordinary leaders shape entire civilizations, a truth that continues to be dangerous today. Now you will discover exactly what Spinoza saw when he looked at these two men without the eyes of faith. The first thing Spinoza noticed when studying Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad was something that should have been obvious to any rational person. Both were extraordinarily charismatic men living in times of profound social crisis. It was no coincidence that their messages found fertile ground exactly when their societies most needed hope. Jesus was born under Roman occupation in a Palestine suffocated by taxes and constant humiliations. The Jewish people lived a brutal reality where their religious and cultural identity was being systematically destroyed by the most powerful empire in the world. It was the perfect moment for someone to appear promising liberation, not through swords, but through a spiritual revolution that would make the last first. Muhammad emerged 6 centuries later in an Arabia fragmented by constantly warring tribes, where social injustice had reached unbearable levels. Mecca was controlled by a corrupt merchant elite that exploited both the poor and religious pilgrims. Arab traditions were disintegrating, and the people yearned for a unifying identity that could compete with the great neighboring empires. Spinoza observed that both Jesus and Muhammad perfectly understood the historical moment in which they lived. They were not mystical visionaries disconnected from reality, but brilliant social analysts who identified exactly what their people needed to hear. Jesus offered salvation to the oppressed through the unconditional love of a God who cared for the poor. Muhammad offered unity to the fragmented through submission to a God who demanded social justice and equality among the faithful. But the genius of both, according to Spinoza, lay in how they shaped their messages. Jesus did not preach against Rome directly. That would be political suicide. Instead, he created a parallel kingdom where Roman values were inverted. The humble would inherit the earth. The peaceful would be blessed. The persecuted would receive eternal rewards. It was a psychological revolution that undermined Roman power without confronting it militarily. Muhammad adopted a different but equally intelligent strategy. He directly attacked Mecca's corruption, but offered a practical alternative, a community based on brotherhood among believers, where wealth would be redistributed through religious taxes and where spiritual merit would supersede tribal birth. It was a social revolution disguised as divine revelation. Spinoza was fascinated by how both leaders used religious language to communicate essentially political and social ideas. Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven, but described a society where the rich had difficulty entering and where the poor were especially blessed. Muhammad spoke of Allah's will, but revealed specific laws about inheritance, marriage, commerce, and war that would completely reorganize Arab society. Neither was lying about their spiritual experiences, concluded Spinoza. They really believed they were fulfilling a divine mission. But this personal conviction did not diminish the fact that both possessed sophisticated understanding of mass psychology, social dynamics, and political strategy. They were mystics, yes, but also geniuses of communication and human organization. The first great similarity Spinoza identified was both men's ability to speak directly to the hearts of simple people, bypassing established religious elites. Jesus ignored the Pharisees and Sadducees, preaching directly to fishermen, tax collectors, and prostitutes. Muhammad rejected the traditional guardians of the Kaaba, taking his message directly to slaves, women, and middle-class merchants who were despised by the tribal aristocracy. This strategy of direct communication, according to Spinoza, revealed that both understood a fundamental truth about social change. Real transformations never begin at the top of the pyramid. They begin at the base, among those who have the most to gain from a new order and the least to lose from the collapse of the old. But there was something even deeper in this similarity. Both Jesus and Muhammad created movements that were simultaneously radical and conservative. They were radical because they promised to completely transform existing social structures. They were conservative because they anchored these transformations in religious traditions that people already knew and respected. Jesus did not reject Judaism. He claimed to be its final fulfillment. Muhammad did not destroy Arab traditions. He purified and elevated them to a divine level. Both were revolutionaries who spoke the language of tradition, reformers who presented themselves as restorers. Spinoza delved even deeper into his analysis and discovered something that would make both Christians and Muslims feel deeply uncomfortable. Jesus and Muhammad were masters in the art of emotional manipulation, and both knew exactly how to use fear and hope to control crowds. This observation was not a moral criticism, but a cold statement about the nature of charismatic power. Spinoza recognized that great leaders have always understood that human beings are not moved primarily by reason, but by primitive emotions: fear of death, desire for belonging, need for meaning, hunger for justice. Jesus perfectly mastered this emotional psychology. His parables were not just moral teachings, they were precisely calibrated psychological weapons. The story of the rich man and Lazarus terrorized the wealthy with the prospect of eternal torments, while consoling the poor with promises of infinite rewards. The parable of the Good Samaritan destroyed ethnic prejudices by showing that virtue did not respect tribal boundaries. The Sermon on the Mount completely reformulated the social value scale, elevating the despised and humbling the powerful. Each story told by Jesus had multiple layers of meaning that hit different audiences simultaneously. The simple found comfort and hope. The educated discovered philosophical depth. Rebels saw veiled criticisms of the Roman system. Conservatives perceived respect for Jewish tradition. It was communicative genius in pure form. Muhammad used different but equally effective techniques. His Quranic revelations combined sublime poetry with apocalyptic threats in a way that hypnotized listeners. Arab culture was predominantly oral, and Muhammad understood the hypnotic power of rhythm, repetition, and alliteration. His recitations were not just content transmissions, they were sensory experiences that altered listeners' states of consciousness. Moreover, Muhammad demonstrated perfect political timing for his revelations. When he needed to unify hostile tribes, he received verses about universal brotherhood. When facing military resistance, revelations about holy war arrived. When economic issues arose, Allah provided detailed laws about commerce and inheritance. The synchronicity between political necessity and divine inspiration was too impressive to be coincidence. Spinoza realized that both Jesus and Muhammad understood something fundamental about human nature. People don't just want to believe in something, they want to belong to something greater than themselves. Both leaders created communities that offered total identity to their members. Being Christian did not just mean accepting certain doctrines about Jesus. It meant entering a spiritual family, where slaves and masters called each other brothers, where despised women found dignity, where illiterate fishermen became apostles of a cosmic revolution. It was a complete transformation of social status, disguised as religious conversion. Being Muslim equally transcended mere belief. It meant integrating into an ummah, where enemy tribes unified under a common identity, where social justice became religious obligation, where each believer saw themselves as a soldier in a holy war between light and darkness. It was Arab nationalism elevated to divine mandate. But you are perceiving something even deeper in this analysis by Spinoza. You are seeing how two men separated by centuries and different cultures discovered the same secrets about human leadership. You are understanding why their strategies worked so well that even today, 2,000 years later, billions of people organize their entire lives around the visions they created. Perhaps you are questioning, is this ability to shape minds and hearts really divine? Or Or is it just human genius operating at the highest possible level? Write in the comments what you think. Were Jesus and Muhammad exceptional men inspired by God, or were they geniuses of human psychology who understood secrets about human nature that most of us have not yet discovered? And if you are getting this far, it's because you have the courage to explore ideas that most people prefer to avoid. Subscribe to the channel now, because what we are going to discover about Jesus and Muhammad in the next parts will challenge your convictions even more. Let's continue this philosophical journey together. Spinoza also observed that both leaders possessed a rare characteristic, the ability to seem completely authentic, even when they were being strategic. It was not calculated hypocrisy, but rather a perfect fusion between personal conviction and political intelligence. They genuinely believed in their missions, but also instinctively understood how to make these missions irresistible to others. Jesus wept over Jerusalem, and his pain seemed completely real, but his tears also served to demonstrate that his love for the Jews surpassed the rejection he suffered. Muhammad entered trances during his revelations, and his spiritual experience was evidently genuine, but these demonstrations also proved to followers that he really spoke with God. Emotional authenticity, Spinoza discovered, was the most powerful weapon of both. People can resist logical arguments and suspect grandiose promises, but they rarely can resist someone who seems completely sincere in their passion for a greater cause. Spinoza's third discovery was perhaps the most disturbing of all. Both Jesus and Muhammad were masters in the art of creating enemies. They did not merely react to external oppositions, but actively cultivated conflicts that strengthened the internal cohesion of their movements. Spinoza realized that human groups unite more easily against something than in favor of something abstract. Jesus and Muhammad intuitively understood this tribal dynamic and used it with psychological mastery. Jesus could not have chosen more perfect enemies than the Pharisees. They represented everything the common people despised: religious hypocrisy, intellectual elitism, collaboration with Rome, and obsession with ritual rules that made life harder for the poor. By attacking the Pharisees publicly, Jesus was not just defending theological principles, he was channeling decades of popular resentment against a class that symbolized religious oppression. His denunciations of the Pharisees as whitewashed tombs and brood of vipers were not just moral criticisms, they were declarations of psychological warfare that legitimized the anger of illiterate fishermen against erudite scribes, of impoverished peasants against prosperous priests, of social outcasts against established authorities. Muhammad used a similar strategy, but adapted to the Arab context. His first enemies were the rich merchants of Mecca, who controlled the Kaaba and exploited pilgrims. By denouncing idol worship, Muhammad was not just promoting abstract monotheism, he was directly attacking the economic system that enriched an elite at the expense of sincere believers. Later, when he needed to unify Arab tribes, Muhammad expanded his list of enemies to include Jews and Christians who rejected his prophecy. It was not gratuitous religious hatred, but consolidation strategy. Nothing unites fragmented peoples like a clearly identified common enemy. Spinoza observed that both leaders were careful not to create enemies who were too powerful to defeat or too sympathetic to hate. Jesus attacked hypocritical Pharisees, not courageous Roman soldiers. Muhammad denounced greedy merchants, not honorable tribal warriors. They chose targets that their followers were already predisposed to despise. But there was an even more sophisticated dimension to this strategy. Both Jesus and Muhammad created enemies in a way that made neutrality impossible. Their messages forced people to choose clearly defined sides. You were with them or against them, served God or Satan, belonged to light or darkness. Jesus declared that whoever was not with him was against him, and that it was impossible to serve two masters. Muhammad divided humanity between believers and infidels, between the house of Islam and the house of war. Both eliminated the middle ground, the gray zone where people could maintain safe distance from their movements. This forced polarization served multiple strategic purposes. First, it created urgency. People could not indefinitely postpone the decision to adhere or reject. Second, it intensified commitment. Whoever chose to follow Jesus or Muhammad had to burn bridges with their previous life. Third, it generated automatic propaganda. Each conversion became a public victory over the forces of darkness. Spinoza also noted that both leaders were experts at transforming persecutions into advantages. When Jesus was crucified, his followers did not interpret this as defeat, but as final proof that the world was so corrupted that it rejected even the very incarnation of divine love. The execution was transformed into definitive validation of the Christian message about human sinfulness. When Muhammad was expelled from Mecca, he did not present this as failure, but as repetition of the historical pattern where true prophets are always rejected by their own peoples before triumphing through divine intervention. The Hijra became the inaugural milestone of the Islamic era, transforming forced exile into sacred migration. Both possessed the rare psychological ability to reinterpret defeats as moral victories and persecutions as prophetic confirmations. Their movements not only survived external attacks, but grew stronger with each opposition faced. Spinoza realized that this dynamic created a self-reinforcing cycle. The more Jesus and Muhammad were attacked, the more their messages about being rejected by the corrupted world seemed true. The more their followers were persecuted, the more united and committed they became. Enemies involuntarily validated the prophecies and strengthened exactly the movements they tried to destroy. But perhaps Spinoza's most penetrating observation was about how Jesus and Muhammad used their enemies to define not only what they fought against, but what they fought for. Hypocritical Pharisees made Jesus' authenticity shine more intensely. Greedy merchants in Mecca made Muhammad's social justice seem more urgent. They did not just create enemies, they created perfect contrasts that highlighted their own virtues. It was moral theater, where each antagonist had been carefully chosen to make the protagonist appear more heroic. Spinoza then turned his attention to one of the most fundamental differences between Jesus and Muhammad, their attitudes toward direct political power. And here he discovered something that explained why Christianity and Islam evolved so differently throughout history. Jesus systematically rejected all opportunities to assume concrete political power. When the crowds wanted to crown him king after the multiplication of loaves, he fled to the desert. When Pilate asked if he was king of the Jews, Jesus replied that his kingdom was not of this world. When the zealots expected him to lead an armed revolt against Rome, he preached love for enemies and turning the other cheek. This rejection of earthly power was not weakness or political naivety, concluded Spinoza. It was a brilliant strategy that made the Christian movement simultaneously harmless to Rome and irresistible to the oppressed. Jesus offered a form of victory that did not depend on militarily defeating the Roman Empire, but on spiritually transcending it. Muhammad chose a completely opposite path. He not only accepted political power, but actively sought it as an integral part of his prophetic mission. In Medina, he became not just spiritual leader, but also judge, general, legislator, and head of state. Islam was born as religion and political system simultaneously. Spinoza observed that this fundamental difference completely shaped the nature of both religions. Early Christianity spread through individual conversions that transformed hearts without threatening existing political structures. Christian slaves continued serving pagan masters. Christian soldiers continued fighting for non-Christian emperors. Christian citizens continued paying taxes to hostile governments. Islam expanded through conquests that simultaneously transformed religious beliefs and political structures of conquered territories. Being Muslim meant not only worshipping Allah, but living under Islamic laws, paying Islamic taxes, being part of an Islamic state. This difference explained why Christianity managed to survive 3 centuries of Roman persecutions, while Islam never needed to go through a similar period of political powerlessness. Jesus had created a movement that could flourish in clandestinity, in catacombs in the hearts of the persecuted. Muhammad had created a movement that needed military victories and territorial expansion to validate its prophetic claims. Spinoza realized that both strategies had profound advantages and disadvantages. Jesus' rejection of political power made Christianity more spiritually pure, but also more vulnerable to corruption when it finally obtained power under Constantine. Christians had no experience in combining spiritual authority with political responsibility because Jesus had deliberately separated these spheres. Muhammad's integration of religious and political power made Islam more effective in rapidly transforming societies, but also more dependent on continuous military successes. When Islamic conquest stopped, Islam faced legitimacy crises that Christianity never experienced. There was also a crucial difference in how the two leaders dealt with violence. Jesus preached radical pacifism, even in the face of extreme injustices. When Peter drew his sword to defend him, Jesus ordered him to put it away, saying that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. He chose to die as a peaceful martyr instead of living as a violent rebel. Muhammad saw violence as a legitimate tool when used in defense of the community of believers or to expand the domain of divine justice. He personally fought in battles, ordered executions of enemies, authorized raids against enemy caravans. For him, holy war was not a contradiction of his spiritual mission, but its natural extension. Spinoza did not morally judge these differences, but observed their historical consequences. Jesus' pacifism made it possible for Christianity to spread through hostile empires without being crushed as a military threat. Muhammad's militancy made it possible for Islam to rapidly create its own empire that would protect and promote the Islamic faith. Both approaches were rational within their specific contexts. Jesus operated in an environment where any direct military challenge to Rome would be collective suicide for the Jewish people. Muhammad operated in a tribal environment where military force was a prerequisite for political credibility and physical survival. But Spinoza also noted a profound historical irony. Pacifist Christianity eventually became the official religion of the most militaristic Roman Empire in history, while militant Islam eventually developed some of the most sophisticated mystical and philosophical traditions in human civilization. Jesus had created a religion that could adapt to any political system because it transcended all of them. Muhammad had created a religion that carried within itself its own political system and therefore depended less on external adaptations. Spinoza then directed his analysis to an aspect he considered fundamental: how Jesus and Muhammad dealt with women and what were their visions about human sexuality. Here he discovered differences that revealed completely opposite philosophies about human nature and ideal society. Jesus maintained an enigmatic relationship with women that challenged all social conventions of his time. He allowed women to follow him on his travels, conversed publicly with prostitutes and adulteresses, accepted being anointed by a woman of dubious reputation, and included women among his closest followers in a culture where this was social scandal. Even more revolutionary, Jesus seemed completely uninterested in sexuality. He never married, never had children, never demonstrated romantic attraction to anyone. When questioned about marriage, he replied that in the kingdom of heaven, people would neither marry nor be given in marriage, but would be like angels. Spinoza interpreted this attitude not as sexual repression, but as a strategy of radical transcendence. Jesus was proposing that human beings could evolve beyond their basic reproductive instincts and find higher forms of love and connection. It was an almost Gnostic vision that saw the physical body as a temporary limitation to be overcome. Muhammad adopted a completely opposite philosophy. He not only married, but married multiple times, had children, and treated human sexuality as a natural and healthy part of religious experience. His revelations included detailed laws about marriage, divorce, inheritance, and even sexual etiquette between spouses. More importantly, Muhammad saw sexual pleasure as divine blessing, not as spiritual obstacle. The Islamic paradise promised eternal physical pleasures, including sublime sexual satisfaction. It was a religion that completely embraced human bodily nature instead of trying to transcend it. Spinoza realized that these profound philosophical differences explained why Christianity developed monastic traditions of celibacy, while Islam always encouraged marriage among its religious leaders. Jesus had modeled transcendence of sexuality. Muhammad had modeled its sanctification. Regarding women specifically, the differences were equally striking. Jesus treated women as spiritual equals in a culture that saw them as men's property. He defended the adulterous woman from the stoners, praised the Canaanite woman's faith, allowed Mary to choose studying instead of cooking, and appeared first to women after his resurrection. Muhammad significantly improved the legal condition of Arab women, giving them inheritance rights, limiting polygamy, prohibiting female infanticide, and establishing legal procedures for divorce. But he maintained a clear hierarchy where men were family leaders and women were their subordinate partners. Spinoza noted that both approaches were revolutionary in their contexts. but pointed toward completely different social directions. Jesus was proposing a radical transformation of human nature, where gender distinctions would become irrelevant through spiritual evolution. Muhammad was proposing significant improvements within the natural framework of gender differences. The historical result was that early Christianity attracted many women because it offered equal spiritual dignity, but eventually developed institutions that excluded women from formal religious power. Islam offered concrete legal protections for women from the beginning, but never fundamentally questioned gender hierarchies. Spinoza also observed how these different attitudes toward sexuality affected the expansion of both religions. Christian celibacy created a class of completely dedicated missionaries who could travel freely and devote all their energies to evangelization, but it also made Christianity less attractive to men who wanted family and offspring. Islamic marriage created stable communities that grew both through conversions and natural births. Muslim families produced new generations of believers while demonstrating that it was possible to be simultaneously pious and domestically prosperous. There were also differences in how Jesus and Muhammad dealt with sexual temptation. Jesus was tempted in the desert by Satan, but the described temptations involved political power and spiritual pride, not carnal desire. His sexual purity seemed natural and effortless. Muhammad openly acknowledged his sexual attractions and regulated them through legitimate marriages and divine laws. When he fell in love with his adopted son's wife, he received a revelation that permitted the marriage but prohibited future adoptions to avoid similar complications. It was a more human and realistic approach to the challenges of male sexuality. Spinoza concluded that Jesus had created an ideal of holiness based on transcending human-animal nature, while Muhammad had created an ideal based on sanctifying that same nature through divine regulation. Both models offered valid paths for human elevation, but implied completely different future societies. The next area of Spinoza's investigation was perhaps the most technically complex: how Jesus and Muhammad built intellectual authority and dealt with rational questioning of their claims. Here he discovered methodological differences that explained why Christianity and Islam developed such distinct theological traditions. Jesus rarely offered logical arguments for his most extraordinary claims. When asked about his authority to forgive sins or cast out demons, he responded with counter-questions, mysterious parables or demonstrations of power that short-circuited rational debate. His preferred method was direct revelation, through miracles that forced observers to choose between total acceptance or total rejection. This strategy of intellectual bypass was extraordinarily effective with simple people who had no training in sophistical argumentation, but who recognized genuine power when they saw it manifested. Jesus spoke with natural authority that did not need external validation because it carried its own evidence. Muhammad adopted a more intellectually sophisticated approach. His Quranic revelations included specific challenges to skeptics. If they doubted that the Quran came from God, let them produce a text of equivalent literary quality. He debated with Jews and Christians using their own scriptures, demonstrating inconsistencies in their interpretations and pointing to prophecies that allegedly referred to his own coming. Spinoza observed that Muhammad treated reason as an ally of revelation, not as its enemy. He argued that creation logically demonstrated the existence of a creator, that the complexity of the universe proved intelligent design, that human justice required cosmic accountability. Islam was born as a religion that embraced rational argumentation within revelational limits. This fundamental difference explained why early Christianity developed an ambiguous relationship with Greek philosophy, while Islam eventually produced some of the most sophisticated syntheses between faith and reason in human intellectual history. Jesus had modeled charismatic authority that transcended argumentation. Muhammad had modeled prophetic authority that incorporated argumentation. In terms of education and knowledge transmission, the differences were equally striking. Jesus chose deliberately simple disciples, fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, people who had no previous intellectual baggage that could interfere with his message. He taught them through direct experience, prolonged cohabitation, and gradual exposure to mysteries they would only fully understand after his death and resurrection. Muhammad, although also initially illiterate, quickly developed a community that enormously valued education and precise preservation of his teachings. His companions memorized his exact words, recorded his actions in detail, and created a tradition of scholarship that would become one of the glories of Islamic civilization. Spinoza realized that Jesus was creating a movement that would depend on continuous inspiration from the Holy Spirit to interpret his teachings through changing historical circumstances. It was a flexible system that could adapt to any culture, but was also vulnerable to contradictory interpretations and doctrinal schisms. Muhammad was creating a system that would depend on careful scholarship to apply fixed revelational principles to specific situations. It was a more intellectually stable system, but one that required a class of scholars to function adequately. The attitude toward other religious traditions also revealed fundamental differences. Jesus demonstrated deep knowledge of Jewish scriptures and cited them as authority, but also radically reinterpreted them through his own person. He was simultaneously continuation and revolution in relation to Judaism. Muhammad explicitly recognized Jews and Christians as people of the book, who had received authentic revelations from God, but who had corrupted these revelations through textual changes and erroneous interpretations. Islam presented itself as restoration of the original message that had been given to Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. This difference created completely opposite missionary dynamics. Christians saw Jews and pagans as equally needing conversion because all were equally lost without Jesus. Muslims saw Jews and Christians as partially enlightened but needing correction, while pagans were completely ignorant of divine truth. Spinoza also noted that Jesus and Muhammad had different attitudes towards secular knowledge. Jesus seemed uninterested in science, mathematics, medicine, or natural philosophy. His parables used examples from everyday agricultural and commercial life, but did not demonstrate curiosity about how the natural world functioned. Muhammad explicitly encouraged the pursuit of knowledge in all areas as religious obligation. One of his most famous declarations was that Muslims should seek knowledge from cradle to grave, and seek knowledge even if you have to go to China. Islam was born as a religion that saw intellectual investigation as a form of worship. These differences explained why Christian universities eventually separated theology from natural philosophy, while Islamic universities integrated religious studies with mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other sciences. Jesus had created a faith that transcended the natural world. Muhammad had created a faith that embraced the study of the natural world as additional divine revelation. Spinoza then examined one of the most delicate questions of his analysis: how Jesus and Muhammad dealt with death, both the prospect of their own deaths and their promises about life after death. Here he found differences that revealed fundamentally opposite philosophies about the meaning of human existence. Jesus demonstrated an almost obsessive relationship with his own future death. From the beginning of his public ministry, he spoke repeatedly about being rejected, persecuted, and executed. He saw his death not as failure of his mission, but as its final fulfillment. Crucifixion would not be historical accident, but cosmic necessity through which human salvation would finally be possible. This anticipation of death gave the entire Christian movement an urgent apocalyptic quality. Jesus taught that his sacrifice would open the gates of paradise for all who believed in him, but also warned that rejecting his offer would result in eternal condemnation. It was a very high-risk proposition with infinite consequences. Muhammad had a completely different attitude toward death. Although he recognized that all prophets eventually died, he focused on building a community that would survive and prosper after his departure. His last words were not about individual salvation, but about unity of the Ummah and continuity of the Islamic message through qualified successors. Spinoza observed that Jesus was creating a religion centered on a unique and unrepeatable event, his death and resurrection, that would permanently resolve the problem of human sin. It was a definitive solution that would not need to be repeated or supplemented. Muhammad was creating a religion centered on a continuous process, humanity's progressive submission to Allah's will through successive generations of believers. It was a historical project that would require sustained efforts over centuries. Regarding promises about life after death, the differences were equally revealing. Jesus spoke of paradise in predominantly spiritual and relational terms. Heaven would be a place where the saved would experience perfect communion with God, where there would be no more pain, tears, or death. where divine love would completely satisfy all human needs. Muhammad described paradise in specific sensory details: gardens with flowing rivers, delicious fruits, silk garments, heavenly perfumes, beautiful companions, refined physical pleasures. It was a vision that completely embraced human bodily nature and promised its perfect satisfaction instead of its transcendence. Spinoza realized that these different visions of paradise reflected different anthropologies. Jesus saw human beings as spirits temporarily imprisoned in physical bodies, destined for purely spiritual existence after death. Muhammad saw human beings as integrated units of body and soul, destined for glorified bodily existence in eternity. The practical implications of these differences were enormous. Early Christianity developed ascetic traditions that saw bodily denial as preparation for future spiritual happiness. Islam developed traditions that saw moderate bodily enjoyment as legitimate anticipation of future heavenly pleasures. Jesus also introduced a radical theological innovation that no previous religion had proposed: the idea that salvation depended entirely on faith, not on works. People could live morally imperfect lives but still achieve paradise through total trust in his sacrifice. It was absolute spiritual democracy that made salvation accessible even to repentant criminals. Muhammad maintained a more traditional approach, where salvation resulted from combination of sincere faith and just works. Allah was merciful and forgave sins, but was also just and rewarded according to concrete actions. It was a meritocratic system that encouraged continuous moral effort. Spinoza noted that Jesus' unconditional grace created simultaneously maximum spiritual freedom and maximum anxiety. If salvation depended only on faith, how could someone be certain that their faith was genuine? This uncertainty would fuel centuries of spiritual anguish in the Christian tradition. The Islamic system of faith plus works created greater psychological stability because it offered concrete criteria for evaluating spiritual status. Muslims could measure their progress through prayers performed, charities given, pilgrimages completed, fasts observed. There were also crucial differences in how the two leaders dealt with the possibility of doubt about life after death. Jesus acknowledged that even his closest disciples sometimes doubted, but he treated doubt as temptation to be overcome through deeper faith, not as intellectual problem to be resolved through evidence. Muhammad offered rational arguments for life after death. If God could create life from nothing initially, obviously he could recreate it after death. If divine justice existed, there should be final accountability, where earthly injustices were corrected. It was an approach that respected the intellectual needs of skeptics. Perhaps the deepest difference was that Jesus presented his own resurrection as definitive proof that death had been defeated for all believers. It was a promise based on specific historical event that his followers claimed to have witnessed. Muhammad never claimed he would return from the dead, or that others could return. Life after death was future promise, based on the veracity of his revelations, not present demonstration of power over death. Spinoza's final analysis focused on the question he considered most fundamental: how Jesus and Muhammad understood the nature of God and what was the relationship they claimed to have with the divine. Here he discovered differences that explained why Christianity and Islam developed not just different, but mutually incompatible theologies. Jesus made claims about himself that were so extraordinary, they forced his listeners to a radical choice. He was either the greatest blasphemer in history, or was literally God incarnate. There was no possible middle ground. When he declared, "Before Abraham was I am," or "I and the Father are one," he was using language that any Jew would immediately recognize as a claim to divinity. Spinoza observed that Jesus never argued in favor of his divine claims. He simply declared them with absolute authority and allowed miracles to confirm his words. It was a strategy of direct revelation that completely bypassed rational argumentation and appealed directly to supernatural experience. Muhammad adopted a completely opposite theological position. He obsessively insisted that he was only a man, only a messenger, only a servant of Allah. When people began to venerate him excessively, he corrected them severely, reminding them that worship belonged exclusively to God. His humanity was not a limitation of his prophetic authority, but its most important characteristic. This fundamental difference created completely opposite religious dynamics. Christians developed doctrines about Christ's divine nature, the Trinity incarnation, concepts that tried to explain how Jesus could be simultaneously completely human and completely divine. It was theology that embraced paradox as necessary mystery. Muslims developed doctrines about Tawheed, absolute unity of God, that rejected any form of association between God and creation. For them, the idea of God incarnate was not just false, but blasphemous. It was theology that prioritized logical coherence over paradoxical mystery. Spinoza realized that these different Christologies and theologies implied different forms of religious relationship. Christians could address Jesus directly as God, could love him as divine friend, could experience personal intimacy with a divinity who had completely shared human experience. Muslims related to Allah through Muhammad's prophetic mediation, but always maintained clear awareness of the infinite distance between creator and creation. Intimacy with God was possible, but should never obscure divine transcendence or humanity's fundamentally creatural nature. The practical implications of these differences were enormous. Christianity developed mystical traditions that sought direct union with Christ through contemplative prayer, spiritual ecstasy, and visionary experiences. It was spirituality that aspired to fusion with the divine. Islam developed mystical traditions that sought maximum proximity to Allah through dhikr, sama, and fana, but always within limits that preserved the distinction between servant and Lord. It was spirituality that aspired to perfect submission, not ontological fusion. Spinoza also noted crucial differences in how Jesus and Muhammad dealt with divine revelation. Jesus claimed to be himself the final revelation of God. He did not just transmit divine messages, he was the divine message. To know Jesus was to know the Father, to see Jesus was to see God, to obey Jesus was to obey God. Muhammad claimed to be the receiver of final divine revelation, but never identified himself with the content of that revelation. The Quran was God's word transmitted through him, but remained eternally distinct from him. Muhammad was the messenger. The Quran was the message. This difference explained why Christians eventually declared Jesus as legitimate object of worship, while Muslims always maintained clear distinction between veneration of the Prophet and worship of Allah. For Christians, Jesus was simultaneously means and end of religion. For Muslims, Muhammad was means through which they reached the end that was Allah. There were also fundamental differences in how the two leaders understood prophetic inspiration. Jesus seemed to operate in a state of consciousness where his human will was perfectly aligned with divine will. He never described receiving revelations as external experiences, but spoke as if his own words were automatically God's words. Muhammad described receiving revelations as dramatically altered experiences of consciousness. He sweated profusely, entered trances, heard angelic voices, felt divine presence as external force that temporarily dominated him. It was classical prophetism, where divine and human remained clearly distinct, even during moments of maximum communication. Spinoza concluded that Jesus and Muhammad represented two completely different paradigms of relationship between divine and human. Jesus embodied the paradigm of incarnation, where God became human to elevate humanity to divinity. Muhammad embodied the paradigm of prophecy, where God remained transcendent but communicated with humanity through chosen messengers. Both paradigms offered valid solutions to religion's fundamental problem, how finite beings can relate to the infinite, but implied mutually exclusive theological universes. Spinoza then directed his attention to an aspect he considered revealing of both leaders' political genius, how they dealt with the question of wealth, poverty, and economic justice. Here he discovered that both Jesus and Muhammad were social revolutionaries, disguised as spiritual reformers. Jesus developed a devastating critique of wealth that went far beyond superficial moral concerns. When he declared that it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, he was not making rhetorical exaggeration, but precise psychological diagnosis about how material abundance corrupts the human soul. Spinoza realized that Jesus understood that excessive wealth creates a form of self-sufficiency that makes it difficult for people to recognize their dependence on God. The rich develop the illusion that they control their own lives and destinies, while the poor maintain clear awareness of their vulnerability and need for divine help. But there was an even more sophisticated dimension to Jesus' economic critique. He observed that systems based on wealth accumulation inevitably create hierarchies that contradict the equal dignity of all human beings as children of God. When he said the last would be first and the first last, he was proposing complete inversion of dominant economic values. Muhammad adopted a different but equally radical approach. Instead of condemning wealth itself, he created a religious system that automatically redistributed wealth through mandatory spiritual taxes. Zakat was not optional charity, but fundamental pillar of Islam that transferred resources from the wealthy to the needy as obligation before God. Spinoza was impressed with the economic sophistication of Quranic revelations. Muhammad received detailed divine instructions about inheritance that protected widows and orphans, commercial laws that prohibited usury and exploitation, property regulations that balanced individual rights with community responsibilities. It was a complete economic system, disguised as religious legislation. Muhammad was creating a society where material prosperity would be possible, but always subordinated to principles of social justice derived from divine will. The differences in Jesus and Muhammad's economic approaches reflected their different strategies of social transformation. Jesus attacked the psychological roots of human greed, trying to transform individual hearts so that just economic systems would emerge naturally. It was revolution from inside out. Muhammad attacked unjust economic structures directly through divine legislation, trying to create systems that would force just behaviors, even from people with selfish motivations. It was revolution from outside in. Spinoza observed that both strategies had merits and limitations. Jesus' approach was psychologically deeper, but more difficult to implement practically. How could Christian communities function if everyone really followed Jesus' advice to sell everything and give to the poor? Muhammad's approach was more immediately practical, but dependent on political authority for enforcement. What if Muslims did not control the government? How to implement zakat in non-Islamic societies? There were also interesting differences in how the two leaders dealt with merchants and business. Jesus chose some disciples from among tax collectors and merchants, but generally treated commercial activity with suspicion. His expulsion of money changers from the temple suggested that mixing religion with commerce was fundamentally problematic. Muhammad was himself a merchant before becoming a prophet and maintained a positive attitude toward honest commerce. His revelations included specific blessings for just merchants and detailed instructions about ethical business practices. Islam was born as a business-friendly religion, as long as conducted according to divine principles. This difference explained why early Christianity mainly attracted the poor and slaves, while eventually developing tensions with merchant classes, while Islam from the beginning attracted prosperous merchants and developed some of the most sophisticated commercial networks in medieval history. Spinoza also noted that Jesus and Muhammad had different visions about work and productivity. Jesus encouraged a contemplative attitude toward material life, observing how the lilies of the field neither work nor spin, but are clothed by God more gloriously than Solomon. It was philosophy that prioritized trust in divine providence over human effort. Muhammad taught that God helps those who help themselves, that honest work was a form of worship, that developing talents and resources was religious responsibility. His parables frequently involved successful merchants and productive farmers as examples of virtue. The implications of these different work ethics manifested throughout history. Christian communities developed monastic traditions that valued voluntary poverty and contemplation over material productivity. Islamic communities developed traditions that integrated spirituality with economic prosperity. Perhaps more significantly, Jesus and Muhammad offered different solutions to the universal problem of economic inequality. Jesus proposed spiritual transcendence that would make material differences irrelevant in eternal perspective. Rich and poor would be equally children of God, destined for the same glorious eternity. Muhammad proposed systematic redistribution that would reduce material inequalities in this life through institutionalized religious mechanisms. Rich and poor would be equally servants of Allah, but with different responsibilities according to their resources. Spinoza then examined one of the most complex dimensions of his comparative analysis: how Jesus and Muhammad built and maintained communities of followers, and what were their visions about ideal social organization. Here, he discovered that both were brilliant social architects, but with completely different civilizational projects. Jesus created a type of community that was simultaneously inclusive and exclusive, in ways that seemed contradictory, but were psychologically brilliant. On one hand, he declared that his gospel was for all nations, that in Christ there was neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, man nor woman. It was radical universalism that broke all traditional tribal barriers. On the other hand, he established membership criteria that were extremely demanding. His followers should be willing to abandon family, wealth, and even their own lives for his sake. It was exclusivity based not on birth or social status, but on degree of personal commitment. Spinoza observed that this combination of universal inclusivity with extreme demands created a unique type of group identity. Christians saw themselves as spiritual family that transcended all other loyalties, but also as moral elite chosen for sacrifices that normal people could not endure. Muhammad developed a different but equally sophisticated organizational strategy. He created the Ummah, a community that combined religious identity with political, cultural, and economic structure. Being Muslim meant not only accepting certain beliefs, but integrating into a complete civilization with its own laws, customs, sacred language, and historical objectives. The genius of the Ummah concept lay in its capacity to unify hostile Arab tribes under a superior identity that preserved their local cultures while subordinating them to common purposes. It was religious federalism that maintained diversity within unity. Jesus emphasized individual transformation that would result in transformed community. He worked person by person, heart by heart, hoping that internal changes would eventually manifest in new forms of social relationship. It was spiritual revolution strategy that operated through personal conversions. Muhammad emphasized community transformation that would shape individuals through positive social pressure. He created institutions, laws, rituals, and traditions that would encourage virtuous behaviors, even from people who were not particularly spiritual. It was social engineering strategy that operated through well-designed systems. Spinoza realized that these different approaches reflected different anthropologies. Jesus believed that true change could only come from within, through spiritual regeneration that would fundamentally alter human nature. External systems could facilitate this change, but could not produce it. Muhammad believed that human beings were highly influenced by their social environment and that creating virtuous community structures was prophetic responsibility. Spiritual regeneration was important, but needed to be cultivated through collective practices and mutual accountability. In terms of community leadership, the differences were equally striking. Jesus chose 12 apostles, whom he trained intensively to continue his mission after his departure. But he did not establish clear institutional structures for succession or ecclesiastical government. It was charismatic leadership that would depend on continuous inspiration from the Holy Spirit. Muhammad established detailed precedents for community leadership through his example as prophet-ruler, but he also did not name a specific successor. The difference was that he had created a political religious system robust enough to survive succession crises through established institutions. Different visions about cultural diversity also revealed contrasting philosophies. Jesus seemed indifferent to specific cultural differences. His gospel should be translated to all cultures, but favored no particular culture. It was universalism that transcended ethnic particularities. Muhammad established Arab culture, especially the Arabic language, as normative vehicle for final revelation. Converting to Islam implied adopting not only Islamic beliefs, but also Arab cultural practices as superior norms. It was universalism that operated through a specific cultural particularity. Spinoza also observed different attitudes toward community growth. Jesus seemed more interested in quality than quantity of followers. He frequently spoke about few chosen, narrow path, small flock. His demands were deliberately severe to discourage superficial commitments. Muhammad was clearly interested in rapid expansion of the Ummah through both conversions and conquests. His revelations included specific strategies to attract new members, integrate allied tribes, and administer conquered populations. It was a civilizational project that required critical mass for success. These different priorities explained why early Christianity grew slowly, through intense conversions that completely transformed individual lives, while Islam grew rapidly through expansions that gradually transformed entire societies. Perhaps more fundamentally, Jesus and Muhammad had different visions about the ideal relationship between religious community and secular society. Jesus taught that his kingdom was not of this world, that Christians should be salt of the earth and light of the world, but not necessarily political rulers. Muhammad taught that Islam should eventually govern all human societies, that separation between religious and secular was artificial, that submission to Allah implied life under laws derived from divine revelation. Spinoza's investigation then turned to a question he considered central to understanding the lasting legacy of both leaders: how Jesus and Muhammad dealt with human suffering and what was their understanding about evil in the world. Here he found philosophical differences that explained why Christianity and Islam developed such distinct theologies about theodicy. Jesus developed a theology of suffering that was paradoxical and revolutionary. He not only accepted suffering as an inevitable part of human experience, but reinterpreted it as possible path to spiritual growth and proximity to God. Blessed are those who suffer, mourn, are persecuted. These declarations completely inverted normal human values. Spinoza observed that Jesus did not offer rational explanations for why God permitted suffering, but offered redemptive meaning for suffering when experienced in union with him. The cross became the maximum symbol of this theology. The most unjust suffering in history was transformed into the most salvific event in history. This approach created a spirituality that could find divine purpose even in the most devastating circumstances. Persecuted Christians did not see their tortures as evidence that God had abandoned them, but as participation in Christ's sufferings that brought them closer to final glorification. Muhammad adopted a more systematic and rational approach to the question of evil. His revelations explained suffering through multiple causes: divine test to strengthen faith, natural consequence of wrong human choices, result of social injustices that should be corrected through community action, or divine punishment for specific sins. Spinoza realized that Islam offered a more intellectually satisfying theodicy because it provided clear categories for different types of suffering and appropriate responses for each category. It was not necessary to find redemptive meaning in all suffering. Some sufferings should be accepted, others fought, others prevented through obedience to divine laws. In terms of physical suffering specifically, the differences were striking. Jesus demonstrated extraordinary compassion for the sick and afflicted, performing miraculous healings that relieved immediate pain. But he also taught that present life was preparation for eternity, so temporary suffering had adequate cosmic perspective. Muhammad also showed compassion for sufferers and encouraged medical care as religious obligation. But his revelations included practical instructions about hygiene, diet, exercise, and preventive medicine that would reduce unnecessary suffering. It was an approach that combined faith with natural knowledge. The attitude toward self-imposed suffering revealed even more distinct philosophies. Jesus practiced fasting, vigils, and other forms of asceticism as spiritual disciplines that brought the soul closer to God through bodily denial. Voluntary suffering could be a path to spiritual purification. Muhammad encouraged moderate asceticism, but warned against extremes that would weaken the body or disturb mental balance. Islam values the concept of middle way that avoids both excessive indulgence and excessive privation. God did not want his servants to torture themselves unnecessarily. Spinoza also examined how the two leaders dealt with emotional and spiritual suffering. Jesus frequently consoled people by describing how God intimately knew their pains and wept with them. He promised that tears would be wiped away, broken hearts would be healed, despair would be transformed into eternal joy. Muhammad offered consolation through reminders about final divine justice, where all injustices would be corrected and all sufferings adequately compensated. He also encouraged active patience, sabr, that combined acceptance with continuous effort to improve circumstances when possible. The different approaches to suffering created contrasting spiritual traditions. Christianity developed mysticism of the cross that found God precisely in moments of greatest anguish and apparent divine abandonment. It was spirituality that embraced paradox as door to transcendence. Islam developed spirituality of confident submission that saw suffering as temporary test within benevolent divine plan that always had constructive purposes. It was spirituality that emphasized trust in divine wisdom, even when not understanding specific circumstances. Regarding moral evil, sin, cruelty, injustice, the differences were equally significant. Jesus taught that every human being was a sinner needing salvation, but that sin could be completely forgiven through repentance and faith. It was vision that saw humanity as fundamentally corrupt, but completely redeemable. Muhammad taught that human beings were born in state of natural innocence, fitra, but were corrupted by negative social influences and satanic temptations. Sin was deviation from original human nature, not expression of inevitable corruption. It was more optimistic vision about basic human potential. These different anthropologies resulted in different emphases in practical spiritual life. Christianity emphasized need for radical regeneration through spiritual birth that would create new nature capable of holiness. Islam emphasized need for education and discipline that would restore natural purity through practices that removed corrupting influences. Spinoza concluded that Jesus offered more radical hope, complete transformation of human nature, but through more mysterious means, divine grace that operated beyond human understanding. Muhammad offered more practical hope, restoration of natural goodness, through more comprehensible means, obedience to specific divine orientations. Spinoza directed his analysis to an area he considered crucial for understanding the rhetorical genius of both leaders, how Jesus and Muhammad used language, storytelling, and communication to transmit their messages in unforgettable ways. Here he discovered that both were absolute masters in the art of persuasion, but utilized completely different techniques. Jesus was master of the parable, simple stories extracted from daily life that contained multiple layers of spiritual meaning. His narratives about seeds, fishermen, shepherds, wedding feasts, and workers were simultaneously accessible to illiterate people and deep enough to occupy theologians for centuries. Spinoza observed that the genius of Jesus' parables lay in their ability to bypass intellectual resistances and implant spiritual truths directly in listeners' imagination. When someone heard the story of the Good Samaritan, they could not simply reject it as religious propaganda. It was a moving human story that revealed truths about compassion that transcended argumentation. Moreover, Jesus used imagery language that created lasting emotional impact. Phrases like pearls before swine, blind leading the blind, whitewashed tombs, and sheep without shepherd became permanent part of cultural imagination because they combined descriptive precision with evocative power. Muhammad adopted a radically different but equally effective communicative strategy. The Quran did not contain parables in Jesus' style, but utilized poetic language in classical Arabic that created hypnotic effects when recited aloud. It was oral literature, designed to alter states of consciousness through rhythm, repetition, and sonority. Spinoza was impressed with the literary sophistication of Quranic revelations. Muhammad combined historical narratives, logical argumentation, detailed legislation, eschatological promises, and apocalyptic threats in a synthesis that maintained listeners' attention through constant changes of style and tone. More importantly, Muhammad understood the power of Arabic language in a predominantly oral culture where poetic excellence was supreme criterion of intellectual authority. By producing texts that surpassed the best Arab poets of the time, he established cultural credentials that made his prophetic claims more plausible. The different communicative approaches reflected different rhetorical objectives. Jesus wanted to transform how people thought about God, morality, and meaning of life. His parables were designed to provoke sudden insights that would alter listeners' fundamental perspectives. Muhammad wanted to persuade people that he really spoke on behalf of God, and that therefore they should obey his specific orientations about how to live. His recitations were designed to demonstrate supernatural origin through literary quality that transcended normal human capabilities. Spinoza also noted crucial differences in how the two leaders dealt with questions and oppositions. Jesus frequently responded to questions with other questions, or with parables that forced questioners to reach their own conclusions. It was Socratic method that developed understanding through self-discovery. Muhammad tended to respond to questions with direct revelations that provided authoritative answers without ambiguity. When questions arose about inheritance, marriage, war, or ritual, Allah provided specific orientations that eliminated uncertainty and debate. These different communicative strategies created contrasting intellectual traditions. Christianity developed cultures of interpretation where multiple meanings were extracted from texts through allegorical, typological, and mystical methods. It was an approach that celebrated creative ambiguity. Islam developed sciences of exegesis that focused on determining precise original meaning of Quranic texts through linguistic analysis, historical context, and prophetic precedents. It was an approach that prioritized authoritative clarity. In terms of memorization and oral transmission, both leaders created traditions that preserved their words with extraordinary fidelity, but through different methods. Jesus' words were preserved through multiple written versions that captured their essences in different cultural contexts. Muhammad's words were preserved through systematic memorization that maintained original Arabic texts without linguistic changes. It was preservation that prioritized literal fidelity over cultural adaptation. Spinoza observed that Jesus frequently used paradoxical language that forced listeners to transcend conventional logic. The last shall be first. Whoever wants to save his life must lose it. It is in giving that we receive. These were formulations that short-circuited rational thought and opened space for spiritual intuition. Muhammad rarely used paradoxes, preferring clear declarations that could be understood and implemented directly. Worship only Allah, establish prayers, pay zakat, perform pilgrimage. It was communication that prioritized practical application over mystical contemplation. The different communicative personalities also reflected in their public preaching styles. Jesus seemed more contemplative and introspective, frequently withdrawing for solitary prayer before teaching crowds. His messages had meditative quality. Even when challenging social conventions, Muhammad was more extroverted and energetic, thriving in public debates and intellectual confrontations. His revelations frequently responded to specific events and contemporary controversies, demonstrating direct engagement with immediate political and social issues. Spinoza approached the end of his analysis, examining one of the most delicate questions: how Jesus and Muhammad dealt with violence, war, and conflict, and what were their visions about when physical force could be morally and spiritually justified. Here he discovered differences that explained why Christianity and Islam developed such distinct traditions about holy war and pacifism. Jesus articulated what was perhaps the most radical philosophy of non-violence in human history. He not only preached love for enemies, but modeled this philosophy even facing torture and unjust execution. When Peter tried to defend him with violence, Jesus rejected this protection and healed the wounded soldier's ear. Spinoza observed that Jesus' pacifism was not cowardly passivity, but revolutionary strategy that undermined oppressors' power through refusal to play by their rules. By not retaliating against violence, Jesus was demonstrating a superior form of power that transcended brute force. More deeply, Jesus understood that violence always corrupts those who use it, even when used in just causes. His kingdom would operate according to completely different principles, where transformation of hearts would be more effective than coercion of bodies. Muhammad developed a much more complex and contextual theology of war. He made clear distinctions between unjustified aggression, which was prohibited, and legitimate defense, which was not only permitted but obligatory when the community of believers was threatened. His revelations about war included detailed rules that limited violence even during armed conflicts, protection of civilians, preservation of property, humane treatment of prisoners, prohibition of torture, respect for places of worship. It was code of war that tried to humanize inevitable conflicts. Spinoza realized that Muhammad was operating as statesman, responsible for protecting a vulnerable community in hostile environment. Absolute pacifism would have resulted in complete destruction of early Muslims. Defensive war was survival necessity, not ideological preference, but there was a deeper dimension to Islamic military philosophy. Muhammad saw war as extension of cosmic struggle between good and evil. When Muslims fought against enemies who oppressed the weak or impeded propagation of divine message, they participated in jihad that had spiritual meaning beyond political objectives. This sacralization of war created traditions of military martyrdom that were strange to early Christianity. Dying in battle defending the Islamic community was considered supreme form of witness that guaranteed immediate entry to paradise. Jesus never promised special rewards for soldiers. He promised blessings for peacemakers. Muhammad promised special spiritual status for mujahideen who died in holy combat. It was difference that would shape religious attitudes toward war for centuries. Spinoza also observed differences in how the two leaders dealt with punitive justice. Jesus demonstrated extreme mercy even for criminals. He forgave the adulterous woman, promised paradise to the crucified thief, prayed for forgiveness of his executioners. It was philosophy that prioritized redemption over retribution. Muhammad established justice system that balanced mercy with accountability. Serious crimes required proportional punishments, but there were always possibilities of forgiveness, financial compensation, or alternative punishments. It was a system that took sin seriously, but offered multiple paths to restoration. The implications of these different philosophies manifested when Christianity and Islam obtained political power. Christians faced difficulties reconciling Jesus' pacifist teachings with governmental responsibilities that included military defense and law enforcement. Muslims had clearer orientations about how to exercise political power consistently with religious principles, because Muhammad had modeled political leadership directly. In terms of interpersonal conflict, Jesus taught unlimited forgiveness, 70 times 7, and turning the other cheek when offended. It was philosophy that broke cycles of revenge through unconditional love that would eventually transform even enemies into friends. Muhammad taught forgiveness as superior virtue, but also recognized right to proportional retaliation when injustices were committed. It was more realistic philosophy about human nature that offered multiple options for conflict resolution. Spinoza concluded that Jesus was creating ethics for saints who transcended normal human instincts through radical spiritual transformation. It was very high moral standard that few could achieve completely. Muhammad was creating ethics for common human beings who aspired to holiness, but still dealt with limitations of human nature. It was a system that encouraged maximum possible virtue within practical realities. Both approaches offered valid wisdom about how to deal with human conflict, but implied different types of societies and different expectations about what religion could realistically achieve in history. The question of violence revealed perhaps the most fundamental difference between Jesus and Muhammad. Jesus believed that divine love was so powerful that it could completely transform human nature, making war eventually obsolete. Muhammad believed that divine love operated through justice, and that sometimes justice required force to protect innocents and punish evildoers. In the final block of his revolutionary analysis, Spinoza reached the conclusions he considered most important and dangerous. What were the true similarities between Jesus and Muhammad that both Christianity and Islam preferred to conceal, and what these similarities revealed about the human nature of religious phenomenon? Spinoza realized that, despite all the theological and practical differences he had identified, Jesus and Muhammad shared fundamental characteristics that suggested universal patterns in charismatic religious leadership. Both were men of exceptional intelligence who understood profoundly the psychological and social needs of their peoples in moments of historical crisis. More controversially, Spinoza concluded that both Jesus and Muhammad were consummate masters in the art of creating social realities through convincing narratives. They did not just report pre-existing truths about God, but actively constructed new ways of understanding divinity, morality, and human purpose. This creative capacity did not diminish the sincerity of their religious convictions, but revealed that authentic divine inspiration operated through exceptional human genius, not independent of it. God had not replaced their human personalities, but had operated through them and amplified them. Spinoza observed that both leaders possessed something rare in human history, the ability to completely reimagine the foundations of social existence and then persuade others to live according to these new visions. It was almost divine power to create worlds through words, but perhaps his most disturbing discovery was that Jesus and Muhammad used similar psychological techniques to induce intense spiritual experiences in their followers. Both intuitively understood how to alter states of consciousness through specific combinations of doctrine, ritual, community, and expectation. Jesus' miracles and Muhammad's revelations functioned according to similar psychological principles. They created moments of transcendence where ordinary people experienced realities that seemed impossible according to everyday logic. They were spiritual technologies that produced real transformations in the lives of individuals and communities. Spinoza was not denying the reality of these experiences or their spiritual importance. He was observing that they operated through natural laws of human psychology that exceptional leaders could learn to use consciously. The deepest similarity between Jesus and Muhammad was their ability to offer people identities that transcended limitations of birth, culture, and circumstance. Being Christian or Muslim meant becoming part of cosmic dramas where each individual had significant role in universal history. Both created cosmologies where ordinary human beings became participants in conflicts between good and evil that determined eternal destinies. It was psychology that dignified ordinary lives by connecting them with extraordinary purposes. Spinoza also identified similar patterns in how both leaders dealt with power and authority. They began as outsiders criticizing corrupt religious establishments, gained followers through demonstrations of spiritual power, and gradually built movements that eventually rivaled and surpassed the institutions that initially rejected them. More significantly, both Jesus and Muhammad understood that authentic religious leadership required genuine personal sacrifice. They were not charlatans who exploited popular credulity for personal gain, but men who risked and eventually gave their lives for their visions. This sacrificial authenticity was crucial for their long-term effectiveness. People can be temporarily deceived by false prophets, but movements that survive centuries require founding leaders who really believed in their messages enough to die for them. Spinoza concluded his analysis with observations he knew would be considered heretical by Christians and Muslims equally. He argued that Jesus and Muhammad represented two different expressions of the same fundamental human capacity, the ability to transcend individual limitations and create new possibilities for collective existence. Instead of being unique in human history, they exemplified potentials that exist latent in all humanity. Other people in other eras had demonstrated similar capacities, and other people in the future could do so again. This was not a conclusion that diminished Jesus and Muhammad, but that situated them within the maximum possible greatness of human nature. They were supreme expressions of what human beings could achieve when combining exceptional intelligence, moral courage, total dedication to transcendent ideals, and deep sensitivity to the spiritual needs of their contemporaries. The difference between them and ordinary people was not the presence of divine elements absent in others, but the extraordinary development of capacities that exist in embryonic form in all human beings. Spinoza ended his analysis arguing that understanding Jesus and Muhammad as extraordinary men instead of supernatural beings did not make their achievements less impressive, but more inspiring. If they were human like us, then perhaps we too could aspire to forms of greatness that would transform the world. This was the most dangerous truth of all, that divinity was not privilege of few chosen ones, but potential of all those courageous enough to transcend perceived limitations and dedicate their lives to visions that would elevate all humanity. Jesus and Muhammad were not the only sons of God. They were the first of many who were yet to come. And so ends the most controversial analysis ever conducted about two of the most influential figures in human history. Spinoza showed us that Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad, far from being eternal enemies as their religions later portrayed them, were complementary expressions of the same fundamental human quest, the need to transcend the ordinary and touch the infinite. They taught us that true greatness does not reside in supernatural perfection, but in the courage to completely reimagine how human beings could live together. They showed us that authentic leadership requires not only vision, but willingness to sacrifice everything for that vision. Most importantly, they revealed to us that each of us carries within ourselves seeds of the same transformative capacity they manifested. The question is not whether we are divine like them, but whether we will have courage to develop our own humanity to the limits of its possibilities. The truth that Spinoza discovered continues to be dangerous because it invites us to stop worshipping extraordinary leaders and start becoming extraordinary leaders. It challenges us to see religion not as submission to ancient authorities, but as inspiration to create new realities that better serve humanity's spiritual needs. Jesus and Muhammad were giants, but they were human giants, and this means that other giants can still emerge among us. History did not end with them, it only began.